Şu anda bu değişiyor da gerçekten. Kısır bir yerde iyi olur. Çok şey var. Gereksiz. Eskiden doğumda da şimdi eğitim olmuş ama şey yapıyorsunuz. Birilerinin kısmı var. Sistemleşmiş yani. Burada olduğunu biliyor. Şey değil ha, her zaman kullanılan yer değil, başlayalım. Bu şeyden en son, sizin böyle bir şey var ya, bu kaplık parası var ya, sonun merkezi var, onun karşısında. Sen görürsün orada şeyler var. Ne? Ha, orada. Mısırlılar da iki yöne söylemiş. Onlarda da bir şeyler var. Sistem. Yani şeyler zarar görmesini istiyor. Diğeri şeyin zarar görmesini istiyor. Ben diyorum
I think I'll use this one.
Well, we can think we can start. Something like that. Let's just begin. Okay. Well, welcome to all of you. I'm the Faculty of Islamic Studies in the Center for the Study of Contemporary Muslim Societies. We're glad you could make it. Today we're going to talk about the political crisis in Turkey, which has been keeping a lot of us busy in the last weeks. And our guest today is Dr. Kerem Öktem, who obtained his DPhil from Oxford in 2006, working specifically on the history of nationalism in Turkey. He has a book that has been translated into Arabic and has been our best academic seller in Turkey, as it were, called The Angry Nation. And he is a fellow at the European Studies Center at the University of Oxford, and also an associate of the Oriental Institute in Oxford, and also he is a fellow of Sabancı University in Istanbul. So I'll leave the floor to our guest. He'll speak for about 55 minutes, and then we'll have the floor open for questions. So, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's a great honor to be here again after just 10 months, 11 months, I think, for a second time at the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies to speak about Turkey and the future of political Islam in Turkey in many ways. I'll try to give you a snapshot of Turkey at the moment. It's actually a situation which is very volatile, very fragile. Some commentators have even used the term political madness. Every evening, for instance, you have wiretappings being released incriminating Prime Minister Erdogan and his inner circle of power. And every morning, the next morning, you have debates in the TV, attacks from the pro-government media. So it's very much like a surreal TV drama which is being played out at the moment. And onlookers follow in awe, shock and paralysis in many ways. What this brings also with it is a number of multiple related crises from a crisis of the rule of law, of trust in institutions, to crisis of democracy, economy and foreign policy. And all this seems to be enveloped by a rapid turn to robust authoritarianism. You may have already followed that the economy of Turkey, until now the biggest source of attraction of the country, has become, is on a downward spiral and has become not only part of the fragile 5 emerging economies, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, India, and Turkey, but it's also become the most fragile of the fragile 5, with the loss of the lira, of the value of the lira in the last 12 months of about 25%, and a loss of stock market value over 20%. Unemployment is also close to 2-digit numbers. So enough material there for a crisis, and I'll try to shed some light on this. Basically on the clash of 2 Islamic political traditions in Turkey, and on what I call the fratricide, even though it's probably not 100% clear yet who will have killed whom at the end, but maybe at the end of this talk we'll have a bit more clarity. Of course, I also have to say that this will be a very tentative analysis, precisely because of this very volatile situation which I've talked about. There's this atmosphere which is shaped by these revelations every day, by wiretaps, by photos, and the questions where they originate from, what their veracity is, how much we can rely on them, is an important one. But let me start by giving you a brief overview of the presentation. So first I'll try to talk about the actors which are important here, history, ideologies, organizational characteristics. Then I'll talk about the current conflict and try to explain it. And then also think about implications, not only for the political future of Turkey, but also what this means for the future of political Islam, for the relationship between Islam and democracy, which are of course questions which reverberate well beyond the borders of Turkey. Now, who are the actors in the current conflict? I think the main quality of this conflict is, or the novelty of it, is that it's neither a conflict between an Islamist party and an army, like Turkey was in the 1990s, or Egypt during President Morsi, nor is it a conflict between the Islamists and the secular establishment, like in Tunisia, for instance, where Al-Nahda had to take a step back, but it's a conflict between Turkey's, and some would argue, the Muslim world's 2 most powerful Islamic movements. The Party for Justice and Development, the AKP, which stands in the tradition of the Milli Görüş, Turkey's mainstream political Islamic movement, and the Hizmet movement of charismatic preacher Fethullah Gülen, or Hoca Efendi, as he's called. And, well, before getting into what is a rather dire theme, I'll start with a cartoon from a few weeks ago, which probably brings to the point the conflict we're talking about. Now, this is one of Turkey's cartoons, and in the background we see the Prime Minister with his wife. In the foreground we see Fethullah Gülen, and Emine Erdogan asks, well, who was that Tayyip? And he responds as well, it's my ex. And we see Fethullah Gülen walking away in tears. Now, of course, it's making fun. The roses are also making fun a bit of the kind of religious symbolicism behind that. You know, this was made for the world's for Valentine's Day. But of course, there is something very serious behind it. And I'll talk about the actors of political Islam in Turkey when my computer comes back. And it's not coming back. It's something. No, it can't be. It was 100%. No, now we have a technical problem. Do we have a Mac charger just to...
I'll check.
Okay, well, something has happened to this computer.
Try F10, F10.
Sorry?
F10, F10.
F10?
F10, F10.
Well, this is a Mac, so here. Okay. Well, if it doesn't come back, I'll have to do without the talk. But give me a few minutes to try to save it. And I hope we'll make it work with a charger, but I'm surprised. Okay, this doesn't look too bad. Yeah, it's back. Yeah. Okay, excellent. I'm back. Let's hope that the computer stays with us. Now, so who are the actors in the crisis we're talking about? You see it already here on the screen. We speak of the AKP and the Hizmet movement, both which have a lot in common and which are divided by other things. First, I'll talk about what they have in common. Importantly, both have their background in the Naqshbandiya Sufi Brotherhood, which was a key agent of Islamization of Turkic tribes in Central Asia and later also in Anatolia. In many ways, it's one of the most important carriers of Islam in the Turkish or Turkic tradition. And it's also at the root of Islamic movements in Turkey after the establishment of the Republic. It also was very important in creating a sense of continuity and of Islamic learning under conditions of the Cultural Revolution of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the secularist nation-building projects, and can be in many ways seen as more recently as a conservative Islamic renewal movement which believes in the importance of transmission of knowledge from a master or sheikh to a disciple. And of course this is very important in the Turkish context because we're talking about a non-Arabic language environment in which the transmission of Islamic knowledge often has to go through sheikhs, through people in between who have the knowledge, who have the access to the sources. This in part explains also why this movement and movements which have developed out of it have often had very strong charismatic leaders like Necmettin Erbakan for Milli Görüş or Fethullah Gülen for Hizmet or Erdogan for the AKP. Now they're all communitarian and collectivist, fiercely anti-communist, especially during the Cold War, socially conservative, but they try to combine modernity and Islam in a conservative Islamic synthesis. They also believe in the Ottoman Empire as a high point of Muslim civilization and want to restore its glamour or influence, if you want to say so. But they also believe in Turkey's role as a chosen country to lead or to provide leadership to the Muslim world. And above all, as I said, both concur that the Kemalist Republic was a traumatic setback for Turkish Muslim civilization, and they wish to overcome its secularist and up to a point, and there are also variations, its ethno-nationalist ideology and institutions. Now you could already say that this would suffice to make for a great coalition and explain why for the last 12 years the Hizmet movement and the AKP established a coalition of power which together succeeded in neutralizing the once powerful military, largely through mass lawsuits, contributed to a new Islam-inspired entrepreneurialism that led to a tripling of the GDP per capita in a decade, so we're talking about a massive economic success at that point. And it helped the emergence of a self-confident and pious elite that has first challenged and then undermined notions of Kemalist modernity. Yet, of course, there are also differences, as both movements have gone through different transformative cycles, and I'll talk about that now. The AKP and the Milli Görüş tradition, again, is rooted, as you can see it here, rooted in the Naqshbandiya. But the tradition of Milli Görüş is important here as well. And Milli Görüş basically could be translated as the national view, but the Milli here, the national, doesn't stand for an ethno-nation, but for the nation of Islam, basically. And its most successful the Milli Görüş was with the Refah Partisi, the welfare party, which got 25% in the local elections in 1994, and in many ways marks the beginning of the tradition of political Islam, which has been marching to power in Turkey ever since. Most AKP core cadres come from this tradition, including, of course, Prime Minister Erdogan, who was Istanbul mayor of Refah since 1994, but also Necmettin Erbakan. So in many ways it's the main Islamist party tradition, which is relatively close to the Muslim Brotherhood in ideology, but also in personal terms. And particularly in Germany, for instance, there were very close ties, or still are, between Milli Görüş and the Brotherhood. In terms of ideology, the Milli Görüş has been described by different authors as third worldist. Its political economy was shaped by an idea of heavy industrialization, but also redistribution and Islamic solidarity. Politically, it's anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti-West, if one can call it like that. It often resorted to anti-Semitic language, but it believes in the Ottoman Empire as well. Importantly, it is not Turkish ethnic nationalist. It is much more oriented towards an Islamic ummah, even though there is a sense of Turkish leadership in that ummatic view of the world as well. In terms of organizational principles, it's thank you very much. It came back for some reason. It works both bottom up and top down, both through networks and state capture. Ultimately, its aim has always been to take over the state and to create an Islamic state or make the state more amenable to Muslims and to the interests of Islam. But it was a highly politicized movement, which is more revolutionary than evolutionary. Despite that revolutionary moment, though, it played a major role in integrating the Islamist margins in Turkey into mainstream politics and turned, that's the thesis of Turkish sociologist Cihan Tugal in his book The Passive Revolution, turned Islamist activists into entrepreneurs and thereby took out the radical moment in there. Now the AKP, which was established in 2001 and is in power in Turkey since 2002, was a departure from this tradition in many ways. Erdogan in 2003, for instance, said, "We have taken off the shirt of Milli Görüş. Milli Görüş gömleğini çıkardık." And this was particularly true for the global outlook of the party and its economic policy. The AKP began on a very pro-Western ticket, pro-European Union ticket. It was very much in favor of integration into global markets, was pragmatic, socially conservative still, and above all, and that's important for us here, it was a coalition between, it was a coalition. It was not a monolithic movement. It was a coalition between the Milli Görüş cadres I've mentioned, other Islamic brotherhoods, the secular center-right, some reformed Kemalists, liberals, and the Hizmet movement. At least since the AKP's third election victory in 2011 and then the Gezi protests last year, however, we seem to witness a return to the status quo ante. We see a gradual dissolution of the coalition. So first the liberals were chucked out, then the reformed Kemalists, the Hizmet movement. So all these were slowly thrown out of the party. There seems to be a return to old school Islamic or Islamist rhetoric and mobilization. The language has also changed considerably towards conspiracy theories and mildly anti-Western rhetoric, which wasn't there before. And then we also have the personality cult and an extremely centralized party organization. So in many ways, Erdogan seems to have put on the Milli Görüş shirt again. And you know, there are some signs, if you want to look for those signs to see whether this is the case. This is from the election campaign of the current local elections, which are upcoming on the 30th of March. And you know, on the right-hand side, you have basically the content of the election campaign. In this case, it says that the Golden Horn was massively cleaned in the last few years. But what is important is what's written there in red, and that says on the red side, the great change in Istanbul has begun in 1994. And 1994 is, of course, the election victory of the Refah party, of the Milli Görüş party, and not of the AKP. And this is something which the AKP would not have brought to the fore until very recently. So I think it's a good insight into where the party is moving. Now the Hizmet network this time, under Fethullah Gülen, also hails from the Naqshbandiya tradition, and this is part of its many jamaats and tarikats, however, has gone to a different direction. There's also another tradition from which it comes, the conservative reformist movement of Said Nursi or Said Kurdi. Maybe the Risale-i-Nur is known here. This is a movement which started off as a tariqa which to defend Islamic values and Ottoman civilization really against the Kemalist secularist onslaught against Islamic knowledge through the dissemination of knowledge. So the dissemination of knowledge, education is very important here. And basically the brotherhood which came out of this tradition is often called the Nurcular, which is also very important in Turkey. And Fethullah Gülen himself comes from this Nurcu tradition. This is an imam who in the 1960s was preaching in Izmir, so he was socialized in a largely secular environment, and hence his movement has a much more civil society based, in its self-understanding, non-political characteristic, which is critical of Milli Görüş and Erbakan, in many ways evolutionary rather than revolutionary. But also, it has a very elitist streak to it. It's elitist in education, particularly in Turkey. There's an idea of a golden generation that will change the state from within, particularly in the security services and the high judiciary. Since the 1980s, we see a transformation from a brotherhood or a jama'ah, to a social movement, which in Turkey is often referred to as jamia, and a massive expansion since the 1990s. In Turkey and abroad, in the economy, Turkey's largest exporters association now, TUSKON, is an organization close to the movement. In education, with hundreds of prep schools in Turkey and high schools, and more than 1,000 schools globally in 140 countries. So we're talking about a massive network, Islamic network here. In terms of ideology, we can speak of different phases here, because I could say that maybe pragmatism and nationalism are the two most important aspects of its ideology. But there's a massive change over time. So in the 60s and 70s, the movement was above all Turkish nationalists and Islamists, so what we call the Turkish Islamic synthesis. In the 90s, with its global expansion and expansion into business sectors, it became a bit more open, but especially after the late 90s, when Fethullah Gülen moved to the United States, it became more interested in the dialogue of civilizations, dialogue of religions. It has come to represent a much more liberal worldview publicly. There are lots of dialogue societies in the world which are supposed to foster a dialogue between different religions. But in many ways, it's still more Turkish nationalist than the Milli Görüş tradition, and more unsympathetic regarding Kurdish group rights. Now, in terms of organizational principles, we're talking here about a decentralized network with both horizontal and vertical connections. Horizontal meaning there are links between the different institutions, the schools, the media, the businessmen, but there's also a vertical line there which is very important, and that's the prerogative of interpretations in all matters of importance by Fethullah Gülen. I mean, he's a charismatic leader of this movement. Then we also have different circles of belonging in this movement. This is a bit of a, I don't know whether you can read it, but basically in the core you have the group around the leader of the group, the Sheikh, the Hoca Efendi. Then you have the activists, you have the businesses around it, and then in the outer circle you have the sympathizers. And what's interesting here is that in every circle there are a different language is often used, there are different modes of engagement, and we can discuss this in more detail. Now, there are some tensions here in this movement, or a number of tensions. Probably the most important is between the idea of a liberal view of the world, of dialogue between different groups and religions on the one side, and the idea of state capture through the creation of a golden generation which will march through the institutions and turn Turkey into an Islamic state on the other. Tensions which actually Sherif Mardin, the very famous Turkish sociologists already highlighted in the 1990s. But still, the Gülen movement is Turkey's most important soft power actor abroad in many ways, and it's probably also the most important, one of the most important Islamic movements in the world, with a massive capacity to mobilize people, but also to teach people. So we see that we have two movements here that have a lot in common. Above all, it's concerned to reconcile Islam and modernity in an authentic, non-Western way, but also the goal of state capture, the idea of a march through the institutions, of changing the state towards a more Islamic constituency. But these are also two movements that diverge in modes of operation and interpretation and have different understandings of the political. So this was about the actors. Now, what about the conflict? This is a conflict that has paralyzed the Turkish state and is pretty much undermining any pretense of a functioning democracy now. It has brought Erdogan to the point of declaring his Muslim brothers of the Hizmet as a parallel structure and a terrorist organizations whose members should be smoked out of their dens. The National Security Council apparently is about to declare a struggle against, the National Security Council has already declared the struggle against these parallel organizations as a top priority. So I'll talk about the milestones of the conflict and then ask basically who is the culprit. So ask, is this a struggle for power in the state? Is this a destructive fratricidal war that will leave political Islam in disarray? Is this a missed opportunity for the consolidation of a modern Islamic political movement? Now, when did it all start? The tensions between the two movements are deep-seated and have been around since the beginning of the coalition in 2002. And I'll give you a few examples of possible points from which we can explain why this coalition has collapsed. But I'll give you just a visible example from Sarajevo, from Bosnia-Herzegovina, among all places. Now this is, Bosnia-Herzegovina has a lot of Turks, of course, and there are two universities in Sarajevo. And the two universities are in the suburb of Uluja, and you see it here. These are, I mean, you just think, you're in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Sarajevo, in a distant suburb of that city, and they're two Turkish universities, and they face each other. On the left-hand side is the Hizmet University, the Burj University, and on the right-hand side is the International University of Sarajevo, which is close to the government. Now, there's only one street between them, but at the opening and honorary doctorate ceremony in 2008, the rector of Burj was not invited to the International University of Sarajevo. So you just have to think, I mean, you're about 1,000 kilometers away from Turkey, you have two Turkish institutions which are facing each other in a foreign city, and the two rectors don't talk to each other. And this is in 2008, so much earlier than the conflict we're talking about. But I think it does give you a sense that the relations have always been a bit uneasy. But the coalition, nevertheless, held until. And the disagreement over the exact date of the end of that coalition there is a disagreement, but you know, there are a few safe bets which I would like to share with you. The 2010 elections, for instance, when Prime Minister Erdogan decided to leave out many sympathizers of Hizmet from the AKP party lists. So there was already a visible attempt to keep the Hizmet out of the party. In February 2012, when the Erdogan-appointed head of the Turkish intelligence services, MİT, Hakan Fidan, was confronted with a court case due to his role in contacts with the Kurdish movement, the PKK. The prosecutor there was apparently close to Hizmet, so this seems to have been the first major publicly visible crack in relations. But then ever since things have become much clearer and much more pronounced. Erdogan's Kurdish policy, for instance, which in many ways envisages some form of autonomy for the Kurdish part, whereas the Hizmet on the Kurdish issue is much more reticent, and it goes back to the main ideological difference there. I mean, Erdogan can go back and look at the Kurdish issue through a more Islamic Ummah-shaped perspective and say, well, ethnic identity is not so important for us. What's important for us is to find a solution to this problem. Whereas for Hizmet, there is still a Turkish nationalist perspective, and they believe that the only way of the resolution of that ethnic conflict would be through education, integration, and investment. Now, ever since the conflict really has surfaced step by step, there's been this disagreement over police violence during the June protests last year, the Gezi protests, and also an AKP bill to close the prep schools, which are a major pillar in Hizmet's network. Now, what then follows, or followed, is a firework of strikes and counter-strikes, which are actually, at least in the Turkish case, quite unseen before, but also internationally, I guess. On the 17th of December, a major series of investigations were launched by the Istanbul prosecutor, which implicated three sons of ministers in shady business and real estate deals, disregard for planning rules and so on. They were taken into custody. Four members of the cabinet had to resign. These investigations also reveal international connections with money laundering with Iran, Reza Sarab. And what was interesting, that when the construction minister Erdogan Bayraktar resigned on live TV, he said, every project I've signed has been approved by Erdogan. If I resign, he should resign too. A follow-up wave of investigations, which implicate Erdogan and his direct family and circle of illegal real estate deals, direct intervention in the judicial process and media freedoms, has been suspended for now by the government. Now the government, in order to stop these investigations, has brought both investigations to a halt, as I said. The suspects of the investigation were released from prison in March. Close to 10,000 members of the police force, hundreds of department chiefs, especially the organized crime units, the anti-terrorism units, were reappointed or to other positions or to inactive duty. 10,000 people, I mean, just imagine, 10,000 people in the security services. Hundreds of judges and prosecutors were also transferred. In the meantime, a number of legal initiatives were pushed through Parliament to bring the judiciary under government control. A new national intelligence law, which is waiting, would turn it pretty much in the Turkish Agency for Intelligence pretty much into a muhaberat-style organization which controls every aspect of life of its citizens. Now, in any case, all of these are there to make it impossible for the current government to be investigated by the judiciary. And what then followed is what I would call the wiretapping war, which is based on intercepted phone conversations between Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan, and his inner circle, which are now released on a daily basis. Most likely they're from the first and second waves of investigations, which are now suspended. And I'll just give you three examples from these leaks. I mean, this is, for instance, one which 17th December was the investigation, and this is a leak from that day where the Prime Minister calls his son, basically to say, you know, get rid of the money which is stored in your house. And the conversation then continues, and in the end, Bilal, the son, constantly says, Tamam babacığım, yes father, yes father, yes father. So Tamam babacığım has now become like one of the running jokes in Turkey, and people immediately know what it refers to. The second is not less revealing. This is a wire tap of Erdogan calling the editor of a pro-government newspaper, a TV channel, Habertürk, basically asking for some news items about the opposition to be removed. And he's very aggressive, and Fratricide, on the editor, is basically very subdued and said, yes, of course, Prime Minister, we'll remove everything as you like. Now that was, of course, shocking when this was released. There's a third one, a very recent one, which is also quite interesting, where basically Erdogan calls the Justice Minister, Sadullah Ergin, to request that the Doğan Media Group, which is one of the largest non-government media groups, is punished in the Court of Appeals after it has been cleared by several lower courts. And he basically says, well, why hasn't this gone through still? And said, well, we can't really do anything, but once it goes into the final instance, maybe we'll be able to do something. And in the end, the Prime Minister says, well, the justice of this, the Lord Justice of this court is an Alevi. And this is interesting. First of all, because it's shocking, of course, because he's basically saying, well, he's an Alevi, he belongs to a distant religious community, he's not of our Sunni tradition. But it also is interesting because Erdogan had called this leak fake. And then the Justice Minister said that when he said Alevi, he didn't mean it in a pejorative way, thereby basically confirming that this conversation did happen. Now, if I had a bit more time, I would also make you listen to one of those recordings just to give you a feeling of what people in Turkey are being exposed to all the time. Maybe we can do that afterwards, if there's still time allowing. Now, what is interesting here is that most of these leaks could not be denied by Erdogan or the government. At no point did members of the government take any steps, for instance, to disprove the tapes. There was only general condemnation. There was a critique that this was intervention into privacy, into the mahram of the family. But most of these leaks have been confirmed by other involved actors. And actually, in some cases, Erdogan has also said that it is his right, for this one here, his right to follow the judicial process thoroughly. Now, who's the culprit? And it's not easy to reflect under these circumstances. And we have to maybe also think about some disclaimers. There are issues of veracity here and also of legality. Are the leaked tapes fake? No institution in Turkey can verify them anymore because there's no institution left in Turkey which is beyond doubt, which would be accepted by all sides. But independent experts and at least one institution in the US have established beyond reasonable doubt that they do belong to the Prime Minister. And as I said, there is strong circumstantial evidence that much of what is revealed was known before. Intervention into media, into judiciary, real estate deals, we knew all this. We're just shocked by the scale of it. Finally, no leak, or very few leaks have been disowned by Erdogan or the government. They have only been described as modified or as tampered with, but basically many of them have been confirmed. So we can assume that the wiretap conversations are by and large accurate. Well, when we come to the legality, which is of course the government lines of defense, if you obtain this information in an illegal way, then it's illegal. It seems that most probably the majority of the leaks are from the aborted investigations which I mentioned. If so, the problem is about how and why they have been leaked and by whom, of course. And if the interception were not made as part of the investigation, but by rogue elements within or outside the state, then the interceptions were, of course, illegal. In both cases, there is some criminal responsibility there, but this does, of course, not offset the crimes which are being documented in those leaks. So, who's the culprit? Well, in both cases, there's mounting evidence that the Gülen movement was involved and probably orchestrated parts or the entire operation on the 17th of December. So Prime Minister Erdogan's allegation of a parallel state, a parallel command structure in which members follow orders from leaders of the movement may not be too far from the truth. And there are also earlier cases which suggest that. I mean, there were these big court cases against the former military elite, which were perfectly justified, but they deteriorated, rule of law, due process was not granted. And they also, the big court cases against the Kurdish movement, that was a cooperation between the AKP and sympathizers of the Gülen movement. So there is sufficient circumstantial evidence that the movement of Fethullah Gülen is involved in one way or the other. But the culpability for the crimes which the leaked documents suggest, the intervention into the judiciary, intervention into press freedoms, high-level corruption, all falls firmly to the Prime Minister and the government. And obviously so do all legal initiatives, which I mentioned, to control the judiciary and so on. All these were made by the government. So much we can say, though, that Gülen and Erdogan may not be the only sides in the war, but they're the most visible ones, and at the moment the obligation seems to be very much on the side of the government. Now, before coming to the implications, I briefly want to reflect on the political economy which is emerging from these tapes, and what it means. In many ways, we see that the political economy of the AKP is based on a bubble. Jesse Colombo in Forbes magazine actually described it as a bubble economy based on hot money, excessive lending and debt, the construction sector, and massive infrastructure investment. Basically a credit bubble which leads to a property bubble, and all that leads to an illusion of prosperity. Of course, also this created opportunities of crony capitalism, bid ridding and favoritism beyond anything which was there before in Turkey. And Colombo says quite clearly that this bubble is about to burst, and he gives an interesting example that maybe you've heard about the skyscraper index. Apparently, many of the world's history's worst crises are preceded by the building of record-breaking skyscrapers. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this here in Qatar, of course. Maybe here it's different. But, this skyscraper index shows it on the basis of the Great Depression, the '97 Asian crisis, that, when you have too many skyscrapers being built, that often is a sign of an overheating economy. And in Istanbul, indeed, since 2008, more than 39 skyscrapers were built and 42 are under construction. So maybe if we believe the skyscraper index, things are not that well. But the related question which comes from there is whether Turkey's success story of the last decade has been a case of mutually reinforcing bubbles in the economy, politics, and international relations. And I'll come to that in my final point now, where I want to reflect about the implications for Turkey, but also the future of political Islam, and ask whether this is the end of the triad of Islam, democracy, and prosperity for which the AKP used to stand, and which I firmly believe was a commendable and auspicious project. Now, for the political future of Turkey, obviously, in the immediate run, there are serious challenges for state capacity and security of the state. There's a massive polarization of society. I've already mentioned the 10,000 policemen which have been chucked around. There's a dual witch hunt by the state against both the Hizmet movement and the non-secular, the non-Islamic opposition at the moment. How is this going to play out in the short to medium run? well, it looks very much like the kind of robust authoritarianism we know from some countries in the region. Centralization of power in the prime ministry and the suspension of the separation of powers. This would basically mean Erdogan is a dictator. However, I mean, this will not be easy to implement, ultimately it has a lot to do with how robust the opposition to this will be in Turkey, and there are signs that it will be robust. But the suspension of the peace process with the Kurdish nationalist movement is also one of the short to medium run outcomes which will have devastating effects on Turkey. But maybe if we take a step back and think about the medium to long-term scenario, if we could argue that if this crisis can be resolved without outside intervention, without military intervention, this may yet be a chance for democratic deepening and the idea that an independent judiciary and free media is good for all and not only for the others. Now, for Turkey's international relations, there is quite a difference whether we think about the European Union or the United States. For Turkey's relations with the European Union, this is of course the worst case scenario because it's been established beyond reasonable doubt that Turkey has diverged from a democratic reform course. All of the current changes, legal changes, go against the grain of EU reforms of what we call the Copenhagen criteria, and the progress report of the Commission has indeed voiced deep concerns over the rule of law and the separation of powers, and voices for the suspension of the accession process are rising. Of course, for relations with the United States, it looks very different because for the United States, whether Turkey is a democracy or a dictatorship or a mild dictatorship is not so important. The US position there is much more strategic in many ways. Also, Turkey has always had either the chance or the curse of the geostrategic dividend, we can call it. For instance, the current crisis in the Ukraine has again made Turkey a very important and indispensable ally in the region. So from the perspective of high strategy and US interests in the region, the developments in Turkey are not so important. But what about political Islam? And you will remember that Olivier Roy, of course, has since 1992 been foreseeing the demise of political Islam as an identity. And there's little doubt that both movements, the Hizmet movement and the AKP, will suffer from this. Though it's still not clear which side will lose the war and who will die in this fratricidal struggle. But both are at risk. In the medium term, I think this amalgamation of piety, economy and politics might become less exciting for voters in Turkey, and it might harm also the reputation of political Islam. But of course, we should not forget that corruption and authoritarianism is not about political Islam per se. But the return to what seemed to be, or what many authors, including myself, have described as an Islamist or neo-Islamist hegemony in Turkey is now very unlikely. For the AKP, I think it will be harder to survive once Erdogan is removed in one way or loses his function in one way or the other. Also, the global or at least regional project of a Muslim Brotherhood coalition, which was very much at the heart of the AKP's foreign policy elites. You know, this number of countries ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood, this dream is now defunct in many ways. For the AKP, massive vote losses will of course only occur when the economic bubble bursts. As long as the economy stays on track more or less, it might keep to some of its potential. But in any case, once the AKP loses that economy and becomes more milli-Görüş, like as I said in the beginning, then it voter potential will drop to around 20 to 25%. For Hizmet, maybe in the short run, it has, of course, now it is facing the Turkish state in many ways, but it's also a more flexible network of strong intellectual cadres and elites, and it is interested in coalition building for survival. For the Hizmet network, this could be a chance to reorganize, become more explicit about its goals, and turn into a transparent global network. But it also needs to answer the question of the final aim. You know, is it establishing the Islamic State? Is it bringing service to the people? Is it both? Is it the missionization, the missioning of the entire world? These questions have never been really answered by the movement, and they have to be answered. So Olivier Roy may be right in that in terms of ideology, political Islam has pretty much exhausted itself in the Turkish context for now. But it is not impossible that a movement like Hizmet can learn from this crisis, and that constituencies of the AKP can learn from it, even though the Prime Minister is now beyond redemption. There are also groups like within political Islam in Turkey, new groups which I just want to flag up, like the anti-capitalist Muslims and the revolutionary Muslims, who explore new political thinking within the Islamic context, Islamist context, and which have developed as an Islamic response to the AKP and its corruption scandals. Also, there is no strong non-Islamist opposition. The secular, well, I don't like the term secularist opposition, but the other opposition parties, which still make up more than, well, around 50% and probably more than 50% in these elections, still suffer from ideological limitations and weakness. They don't really offer a vision for the future. So, maybe not the end. But who would have thought that 10 years ago that Turkey would be caught in a struggle for power, not between the mighty generals and the Islamic movement, but between two Islamic movements. And that pretty much all countries in the neighborhood, Iraq, Syria, the Ukraine, Greece, would be facing existential threats to their survival. And that political Islam would have gone through a rapid cycle of boom and bust in the Middle East. Or that many post-World War I territorial arrangements in the region would be in jeopardy. Yet this is the new neighborhood of Turkey for the next years to come, and Turkey is unlikely to be a haven of peace and stability amidst the multiple bursts of its many bubbles. As for the future of politics inspired by Islam in Turkey, I think many lessons will have to be learned. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for quite an interesting presentation. I take it we have a lot of questions. So
maybe it has to settle first.
Maybe take this time. So, any questions? Okay, Dr. Crane, then First Khalifa. We can pass them.
There is a, yeah.
A few days ago, the guy I consider to be the leading geostrategist in Saudi Arabia said that the Arab world is hostile to Saudi Arabia, Turkey is hostile to Saudi Arabia, Iran is hostile to Saudi Arabia, the only friend is a greater Kurdistan. And I asked him, are you serious? My question is, are they worried about the neo-Islamism of the Hizmet, or are they worried about the enlightenment of the Gulen movement? What is the hostility of Turkey to Saudi Arabia, both domestically and internationally?
Should I answer directly, or do you want to?
It's up to you. It's up to you. Do you rather have a number of questions or one by one?
Well, because I'm not sure whether I can give you a satisfying answer on this, but let me just explore some possible answers. Now, the Turkish government is maybe not hostile, but its relations with Saudi Arabia are not very good. Its relations with Qatar, for instance, are much better. And there are a number of regional political reasons for that, of course. And I think in many ways it is the government's, the AKP government's predilection for the Muslim Brotherhood, which at the moment makes relations with Saudi Arabia problematic in many ways. There are, of course, also deeper reasons for that. I mean, generally, Turkey has, the Turkish government has been very critical of, for instance, Saudi Arabia's real estate deals in Mecca and Medina, and like the destruction of Ottoman heritage. We should not forget that before Saudi Arabia, of course, it was the Ottoman. The Hajj was done under the Ottoman sovereignty and all that. So there's a historical streak there as well. More deeply, there is an understanding of Saudi Arabia, and then later also Saudi Arabia as a product of British imperialism against the Ottoman Empire. So there are historical roots for that, but I think the main problem at the moment really is the current regional power plays, where it's on a different side. But I find it very interesting that this analyst thought that Greater Kurdistan would be Saudi Arabia's greatest ally. I mean, this interest in Kurdistan has, of course, also been voiced by Israel, for instance. The idea that there is now a non-Arab actor in the region which could be an ally against the other Arab states, which is also interesting. Now, Greater Kurdistan is, of course, not a very likely project in the near future, but what we've seen is that there is a very important developments in the region, and we have, of course, the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq. Now we have the area of Rojava, which is the part of Syria, which is under Kurdish administration, and it's and there's a Kurdish, there's Turkey's Kurdish region, which is now increasingly turning into an autonomous area. So in many ways, the idea of a Greater Kurdistan would also mean a division of Turkey. So it's a double-edged kind of interest, which, or not interest, but it's an interesting perspective there. Thank you.
Professor
Thank you, Doctor. I just noticed that your analysis depended largely on political leaks, and I wonder to what extent can we depend on leaks in political analysis?
Okay.
I heard the word leaks actually from your title here.
Well, I mean, that was, of course, just one aspect of the talk I gave. I talked about the two movements, their histories and their foundations. But we're talking about a massive conflict at the moment. I mean, a conflict where two political movements are trying to destroy each other. And part of that war are these leaks. So, of course, I have to present them, but I've also tried to show why we have very good reasons to believe that they are accurate. Because there's, as I said, both circumstantial evidence and other evidence which suggests that they're accurate. So of course this is a political analysis. I mean, this is not, I didn't try to analyze it from a theological perspective, the differences between the movement, because I couldn't do that, I'm not a theologian. So I'm trying to understand what kind of conflict we're talking about, what the stakes are, and who the sides are who are involved. And I think the leaks tell us a very important story, which we have to take very seriously. If they weren't serious, if they were fake, if they were unimportant, then the government wouldn't try this much to make it impossible for them to be leaked. I mean, you know, including changing the internet law and so on. And, I am, unfortunately, I wish I wasn't, quite convinced that the leaks quite clearly show how the AKP has been functioning in the last few years. It would be even better if we had leaks about the Gülen movement as well. I mean, then we would have a more complete picture. But
quality of leaks.
Yes, exactly.
Adi?
Assalamu alaikum. I have one question to ask actually. From your presentation about the various groups in Turkey, it shows that Islam has set the benchmark of politics in Turkey, not the liberals. So, despite of this, the two Islamic movements competition, so even though one of them lost the fight or anything, it's still they who will win the competition, because from the presentation you said you didn't develop a lot about, you didn't develop more about like those liberals. Where are the liberals?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I think that's my question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, you're very right, of course. Even though the 2011 elections show the high point of the political Islam in Turkey, with the AKP reaching almost 50%. Not, I mean, they got 49.9%. But ever since, it's been the Islamic aspect of politics which has been hegemonic, which has had the benchmark. The reason for that is that there is not a 50% liberal party on the other side. I mean, I have to say, actually, there's no. Sad to say that, as in many other countries in the region, there is no liberal party and no real liberal political tradition. The other 50%, if we call them non-Islamic or non-Islamist movements, are divided into three major political blocks, which have very little in common. There's, with about 25 to 30% the Kemalists, or the Republican People's Party, which is a coalition, again, of different actors ranging from old-fashioned Kemalists, extreme secularists, nationalists, Alevis, to modern social democrats. The second largest group is the Nationalist Action Party, which is a right-wing group moving a bit more into the center, which is around 15%. And then the third largest bloc is the Kurdish National Movement, which is particularly strong in the Kurdish areas, where it gets between 50, 60, sometimes 70%, but which is almost not active in the West. So the other 50% is both divided along ideological and ethnic lines, and also divided within the parties. The Republican People's Party, for instance, which is in a way the closest to a social democrat party, is really trying above all to hold together the party rather than starting a process of ideological modernization, which could make it a credible alternative to the AKP, for instance. So that is in many ways the major problem, the inability of the non-Islamic part of politics to develop a future vision for society. However, I mean, it's very likely that these parties will all benefit from the AKP's current crisis. I mean, the members of the Gülen movement are not going to vote for Erdogan. The moment the economy deepens further, they will lose votes, and people will vote for the other parties. But that will just prolong the current situation. It's not really creating an alternative. So the reason why political Islam or parties like the AKP might linger on is not only, is above all also the fact that there's very little credible alternative.
We have this here first and okay, so no, the gentleman is here first, so we'll go this, you and then here. Please go.
Thank you. Two parts question for you, please. The first, do you foresee the possibility of resurgence in the military as a role player in the current crisis, or has it been really purged and cleansed from the old guards that Erdogan tried to do his utmost to get rid of? And the second part, can you shed some light about this infamous deep state that people talk about in Turkey, and I believe the term they use is yes, yes. Do you think it might play a role in what's going on with this state?
Well, thank you very much for this question. Yes, the resurgence of the military is definitely now possible because now things are happening so fast, and in fact Erdogan, who is in a survival, he sees himself in a struggle of survival. He's expressed it several times. He's been making advances to the military in many ways, and with now a new law was also pushed through, which limited the term in prison under investigation to 5 years, which means that a lot of the accused of the Ergenekon trials and also of a number of deep state actions are now being all released, which is seen as a clear sign by the government to the military that they might want to kind of work together again. What we also see is that the purges which pushed the military into the corner, because we really didn't have many constitutional changes. The military was pushed into the corner and was made inactive by these massive court cases, where the main pushing fact was not, or interest was not the AKP but the Gülen movement, which is interesting here. I mean, and this is, I think, one of the Hizmet movement's most important successes, to have put the military in the corner. The AKP allowed that to happen, but it didn't actively support it, as we understand now. So, the military might come back, but of course, if it comes back, then I would almost think that it could be a sort of a variation of the Egyptian scenario, because if the military comes back, it's not going to come back to support Erdogan. I'm pretty sure about that. And in terms of deep state, the deep state has again, with the Ergenekon and Balyoz trials, the deep state has been pushed back and its operations have been slowed down by these big court cases. Again, that was, I think, the success of the Gülen movement. Now that these people are released, of course, their operations will be back on the street again, and so I wouldn't be surprised if we have manipulative, kind of actions, murders, and so on, all that happening, which had been actually defining part of Turkish politics throughout the 90s. The actors of these murders and so on are slowly being released into freedom, and they are returning. So in many ways, the deep state seems to be being reconstituted now under the AKP. But of course, we're talking under conditions of extreme crisis, and everything is happening very fast. And it might look completely different, and we might all break down tomorrow. But this is at least how it looks like.
دكتور شكرا لك على المحاضرة. على سؤالي شكرا لك دكتور على هذه المحاضرة. أنا سؤالي لعل ننتقل من الجزئيات إلى الكليات. قبل مدة كتبت estimate of situation، تقدير لموقف لحالة. وجدت أن في بعض الدول الصراع يكون إسلامي، فلو رجعنا إلى بدايات هذا القرن وجدنا كان هناك صراع ما بين المدرسة الإخوانية ما بين حسن البنا ومن ثم سيد قطب. انتقل هذا الصراع وهذا الخلاف إلى المدرسة الإخوانية في سوريا ما بين المدرسة الدمشقية والمدرسة الحلبية، ووجدنا هذا ينتقل حتى في باكستان. وهناك حقيقة تماثل بين ما يحدث بين أردوغان وكولين وما حدث بين يوسف إبراهيم ومهاتير محمد، خصوصا هناك توأمة كبيرة جدا بين الحالة الماليزية والحالة التركية. واليوم نشهد هذا خلينا نسميه الخلاف أو الاختلاف ما بين حزب النور والإخوان. يعني هل هذه ظاهرة، وما تحليلك لهذه الظاهرة من ظل المعطيات في تركيا؟ شكرا لكم.
Well, I have to say I'm actually out of my depth here. I mean, I thank you very much for this, especially the reference to Malaysia and the early Muslim Brotherhood and the different currents there. But I don't think I have the depth to compare it on that ground. But thank you very much for the idea. I will definitely follow up on that. But what is interesting is that, of course, in the tradition of Milli Görüş, both Hasan al-Banna and Said al-Qutb are very revered theoretical thinkers of Islamic political thinking, let's say, and action. Whereas in the case of the Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gülen, these are not the main references. So it is interesting that the Hizmet movement has ended up in such a political place now, even though it understands itself as a non-political movement which is all about education and about passing on Islamic knowledge, in which it is also different from both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Milli Görüş movement. But thank you very much. I'll definitely follow up on your suggestion.
Sorry, we'll go here first. Gentleman here first. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I have 2 points. Many people in the Arab world consider Turkey as the last bastion of moderate pragmatic Islam. Do you think that the failure of the AKP internally and on the external challenges could lead to radicalize more Turks and already radicalized PKK? The second point is, do you think that rectifying the relations with Israel could be considered a gateway to a good relation with the European Union and the integration of Turkey? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, radicalization might certainly come. Maybe more, I mean, the Syrian war is an important effect there, which has not directly to do with the crisis, but has something to do with the AKP's foreign policy blunders in many ways. I mean, not only has Turkey been supporting political groups like Al-Nusra and so on, which, you know, you can think about them what they like, what you might, but they're not moderate pragmatic. I mean, that much we can say. More importantly, there are thousands of fighters, jihadis from Turkey who have joined the war in Syria. They're mostly from Kurdistan, I mean, mostly from the Kurdish areas. But of course, when they come back, there's an expectation that new forms of, I don't know how you want to call it, like Tekfiri jihadism or Tekfiri Saddam, that these kind of ideologies, which in Turkey so far haven't found much circulation, might might actually be brought back. And I think that is of a major concern. Of course, radicalization around the PKK will happen the moment the peace process breaks down. It's getting there at the moment. I mean, the leadership, the military leadership of the party has already, of the PKK has announced that the AKP is not a counterpart in the peace negotiations anymore because it has lost its political legitimacy. So there are at least these two moments of radicalization, but also even more than that. I mean, of course, one of the great successes of both the Refah, the party which preceded the AKP, and the AKP was that it gave people who could otherwise be radicalized a credible stake in the political system. And you know, a lot of people who would otherwise have gone and taken to war, become involved in terrorism, actually went into business. And you know, I think that was a very good effect of the AKP. And now, if we see kind of if we see a destruction of the AKP, a loss of the center of this idea of you know, economic development and religious ideas, if that breaks down, then I think some people on the margins will go into radicalization. That is very possible. And as for the relations with Israel, well, no, I think better relations with Israel has no impact on Turkey's relations with the European Union. Turkey's relations with the European Union are based on a completely different set of legal values, basically, and Turkey was trying to become a member of the European Union, so it's much more about you know, what kind of state Turkey is, whether there's democracy, and all that. But for relations with the United States, it's of course very good. And what we see is that the government is trying to ameliorate its relations with Israel massively, because it has realized that it has lost the support of the European Union. And in order to survive, it needs US support. And in order to have US support, the better relations with Israel you have, the better. And so I don't know how they're going to sell this to the Arab world, but, or at least to parts of the Arab world. But the relations with Israel are definitely getting much better at the moment. And there's also, you may remember the Mavi Marmara affair, you know, the flotilla affair. It appears that Turkey is very close to reach a deal over the, what's the word, the reimbursement, obviously. The compensation of the victims and so on, which is of course like a nasty affair in the first place. Yeah, so I think relations with Israel, there's also another regional aspect to it, the natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean between Cyprus, Israel and Turkey, so there's a new kind of, and water as well between Turkey and Israel, so there seems to be a new deal coming up in that part of the region.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. My question is kind of related to Dr. Khalifa's question. Like on the ground, how can we say this will affect or to what extent Turkish people will, or the trust of Turkish people will change according to this conflict between the movements or the elites toward the Islamists, of course, particularly.
Okay, sorry, can you just repeat it and speak a bit louder, please?
Okay, in what extent this conflict would reflect to the trust of Turkish people toward the Islamists?
Towards the
Islamists.
The Islam, well.
And you give percentages like 50% of secular and Islamists, but in what stage these percentages are recorded? Because I think by the time it keeps changing, right, according to what is going on.
Yes, thank you.
There's a question
okay.
that's supposedly related to this.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is related to Doa's question, because
as far as I know, still many Muslim groups supporting Erdogan, even after this recording, phone recordings. As for instance, Milli Görüş, as far as I know, they support Erdogan in this clash, or the other side of Muslim movements, as far as I know. So what do you think of that?
Yes, thank you very much for both questions. I mean, now, first of all, when we say 50% voted for Erdogan, it doesn't mean that 50% are Islamists. Because the success of the AKP, when it moved away from or out of the Milli Görüş and the Refah tradition, was to present a political vision which appealed to more than Islamists. So it appealed to a much larger group of people of different political backgrounds and became a mass movement because of that. I mean, the maximum voter potential of Islamist parties in Turkey, I think, is around 25%. You know, give 5% on either sides. But at the moment, the most Islamic movements, or most Islamic brotherhoods, as you say, are behind the AKP government. And they have good reasons for that. I mean, first of all, ultimately, they come from, you know, from a common history of suffering, you can say, even under the Kemalist Republic. I mean, all Islamic movements had to basically be hidden in the back room and had to organize in the dark in order to survive through the Kemalist period. But also because a lot of people are afraid that, you know, if Erdogan goes now, then maybe these old limitations, like, you know, not being able to study with a headscarf, not being to work with a headscarf, that all that might come back. You know, and that fear is not completely unfounded, even though I think that it's also impossible to, you know, to implement these things again after this point. But I think that fear is there. There's also another fear by many people who have benefited from the rule, and this goes well beyond the Islamists, but you know, extends to the 50% we're talking about. They've seen probably the economically best years of their life. I mean, so many people in Turkey have experienced their life getting better. And like anybody else in the world, they don't want to lose this. So they do hope that, you know, Erdogan somehow can still bring it back. In that case, I think that's a very rational choice. The problem is that, of course, Erdogan brought this much prosperity to the country because Turkey was able to act in the international global markets. And it was a credible partner. But with these legal changes, with this shift towards authoritarianism, it's going to lose the support of international markets, and then the AKP is going to lose its voters as well. As many as you like. As many as the audience likes.
Okay, well, we can have 3 more in total. And we'll do Adi first, then did you ask before? You asked? Okay, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Professor Simon, for the chance. Actually, I have a coming up question. Probably is a little bit speculative.
Well, the whole talk was speculative.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. What do you think about the development of Islamic parties? Right? I can base it on my previous question. Right? They set the benchmark. How do you see it as you know, if in comparison with the Islamic civilization in the past? The competition between Islamic dynasties were not something strange, right? Mm-hmm. So could you see this as in light of the revival of Islam, you know, revival of Islam in the 21st century? Okay, I think that's all.
Well, if the revival of Islam in the 21st century is based on fratricide, that might also have reverberations in Islamic history, obviously. But I don't think it's a very good start. I mean, when we think about Islamic dynasties, of course we're talking about, I mean, if you want to establish such a long short-term historic perspective may be, but the question is such a perspective going to help us in understanding the crisis? Because this crisis is, I mean, I'm sure you have realized this is not about Islam. This is a crisis about politics. And this is, it's just that the main actors here, they identify in one way or the other, or they use Islamic references in one way or the other. But none of the, I mean, you know, none of the wiretaps I gave you. You just have to remove a few references, and they would be, you know, they could be pretty much be almost anywhere in the world. I mean, of course, the response to that would be different, probably. I mean, in Western countries, there would certainly be a government reshuffle after that. But I don't think that the framework of Islamic history is necessary in order to understand the dynamics of what is a deeply political conflict about money, about power, about corruption, and all that. But it's important that I think Erdogan and the AKP managed to reframe all, you know, democracy, economic development, entrepreneurialism, you know, all this in a language which was appealing for pious Muslims even, let's say, who are slightly more radical, to even seculars. So, and I think that was the big success, i.e. Using the Islamic reference to bring together like the middle, you know, the middle ground of society for a new growth and development package. That was a big success. But apart from that, I don't see this as a revival of Islam. I think in the short term, I think the reputation of political Islam is going to suffer, and maybe even also of the faith, because of course the instrumentalization of faith in order to get power is something which people are also asking questions about.
We have two questions from all the other two Turks I know of. First, Dr. Tok, and then Mehmet. Well, that will be our last three questions. I've been itching to ask questions, but I've not asked them. So, Dr. Tok?
Just first of all, thank you so much for this brilliant analysis. It's really thought-provoking, and also there's a lot of food for thought. My question is like more about this kind of disconnect, or maybe you can consider it as a kind of asymmetry between this realm, the political realm that you're talking about, the conflict, with a lot of room for instigation. But what is the explanatory power of this conflict on the streets, especially that...
The explanatory or exploratory?
Explanatory power of, like, how do you see the linkage between all this political conflict and the social outbursts right now happening in Turkey, given that right now, if you look at the demography of people on the streets, you see that most of them were born in post maybe mid-80s or maybe early 90s. And historically in Turkey, we always considered this generation as apolitical and really quite relevant, and more the children of neoliberalism and globalization, so on and so forth. So what happened that this generation is really revolting, is really on the streets, really harshly, and they are putting everything out there to change it. So this political conflict, like on the one hand, and the social dimension on the other, especially the recent funeral of this young boy, actually, it became a national event, maybe the first in Turkish history. It's kind of unique. So what happened then? So is it just a matter of this political conflict, or has there been a kind of more long-standing discomfort against the Erdogan government in the past 10 years that couldn't be diagnosed properly?
Well, thank you very much. This is it's actually very helpful and very thought-provoking as well. What is, I think, amazing is only last year in June, when we had the Taksim protests, the Gezi protests, you had a sense that people were claiming back agency, you know, and everybody I spoke to in Istanbul had a view on it, and they were, you know, they were out there in the streets to take their destiny into their own hands. What we see now, of course, with this, as you say, I mean, it's a very high level, almost abstract power struggle, that these people, that agency has been taken away. And because we don't have 3 million people on the streets now, as there were in last June. I mean, there's still clashes, there's still, with the exception of the funeral, but there's still clashes, there's still demonstrations, but we're talking about a much smaller group of people. We're talking also about radicalization within that group. And of course, I mean, yes, there is a deep there's a deep criticism and frustration with Erdogan's politics. But this, of course, doesn't mean that, I mean, we're still talking about, you know, 3 million in 70 million is not much. So as long as you believe in the ballot box, that is a limited phenomenon in many ways. But I still believe that there is a relationship between what's happening in this kind of absurd high strategy, or, you know, high discussion on the one, and what's happening on the ground. And we may not see it yet, but of course what's happening is that the government is not, the Erdogan is now ruling by polarizing society, and by making enemies, and by making different groups of society, turning them into enemies. And I think the aftermath of the funeral of Berkin Elvan, where basically, and this is one very young 14-year-old boy who was shot by the police with a gas canister 269 days ago at the Gezi events, and he was in hospital fighting for survival for 269 days, and he died last week. And his funeral became a major event with 300,000 people, I think, attending, something like that, to which the Prime Minister didn't even, you know, didn't say anything about it. And then the next day, someone else was killed. It's not very clear who, under what circumstances, but that was a martyr which Erdogan claimed, that he immediately took side with his family, against the will of that family, but you know, who said, well, you know, both these children are our children. So what Erdogan is doing there is a terrible kind of cynical way of divide and rule, and that, of course, if that goes on for long enough, that will have an impact on the streets, which will be much, which will be a very negative dynamic, I think. Thank you.
The more you speak about it, the more disturbingly, disappointingly, and worryingly, it sounds like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is also just not.
Well, I mean, can I maybe, because the whole, I mean, the tragedy with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, of course, and its removal of Morsi by Sisi and so on, I think had a major impact on the government and on Erdogan. I think Erdogan sees himself a bit like Sisi did, like Morsi. I mean, I think he really believes that there's a whole state and everybody to come and get him. And his responses are very excitable. I think, I mean, actually there's a number. Actually today, the Chamber of Doctors, the Chamber of Doctors, the medical chamber, has released a communiqué. Now this is like one of Turkey's most important professional organizations, has released a communiqué that they're very worried about the mental state of the Prime Minister. And I think they're very right.
It looks like it, unfortunately. Mehmet?
Thank you, Doctor, for your speech. I want to ask, why Gülen movement wants to get power? Because you mentioned it is this conflict is a war for power. Okay, the AKP is a government of Turkey, and they want the power. But why Gülen movement wants to get power, and for whom? For example, also the AKP is accusing Gülen movement. They are working for America, also for Israel. And what is the role of America and Israel in this 17 February event. You know, the Turkey economically, politically has up a lot. I mean, can you touch this issue a little bit?
Why does the Gülen movement want power? That's a very good question, and I think that's a question which the Gülen movement or the Hizmet movement has to ask itself, because I think it's not very clear. Elizabeth Özdalga asked that question and said, well, the Gülen movement, the Hizmet movement is an interesting thing because it started off with a clear, like an Islamic Jamaat, with a certain organizational principle, with a certain goal to bring Islamic knowledge to people, to provide educational opportunities and so on. But what the Hizmet movement has turned into is now such a massive network that it's not clear what the real aim of this is, apart from a certain type of activism. And every 10 years or so, there's a new kind of a new direction of that activism. First it was Turkish nationalism, then it became religious dialogue and so on. I don't think that it's very clear. But of course, one important goal has always been to make Turkey an Islamic country. I mean, it's an Islamic country anyway. To make it more Islamic, to bring an Islamic government through the golden generation of pious but successful people and so on. Well, more lately, they've turned also into a global mission in the world to spread out a certain understanding, a Turkish understanding, what they believe is the Turkish understanding of Islam in the tradition of Said Nursi. I mean, all these schools are about that. So, you can bring a lot of different goals and interests together. Now, how was it possible that the Gülen movement became so much bigger after 98, 99, when Gülen moved to the United States? Well, that's a very important question. The question that Gülen has been living since 98 in Pennsylvania is obviously not a question we can completely dismiss. It's important. If he was not serving, or if he was going against US interests, then he would certainly not be in the United States. That much we can certainly say. I think there was a major overlap of interests for the US after 9/11, needed a prime example of moderate Islam, of the good Islam, the Islam we like, and the Gülen movement was happy too. So I think there was a coalition in many ways, an overlap of interests. Now, to what extent the US and Israel is involved in the 17 December investigations, I really can't say. I don't know. But the world of intelligence gathering is not my expertise.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بداية شكرا جزيلا. بداية شكرا جزيلا على هذه المحاضرة القيمة. سؤالي، ألا تعتقدون أن الصراع السياسي التركي الداخلي كان له أثر على الموقف الرسمي التركي تجاه سوريا، الصراع الدائر في سوريا، ولعل ظهر ذلك واضحا من خلال تصريحات مهادنة أوضحها ما جاء على لسان وزير الخارجية التركية في طهران عندما قال أو صرح بإمكانية حل المشكلة السورية سياسيا وليس عن طريق دعم المعارضة. أقصد دعم المعارضة عن طريق الحرب.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, and we have hardly talked about foreign policy, so this will give me a brief window of opportunity there. In many ways, when you remember Turkey's foreign policy 5-6 years ago, it was this massive pro-activism. Davutoğlu was everywhere, like I did my fieldwork in some fieldwork in the Balkans in 2008, and every city I went to, Davutoglu had been there either a week before or 2 days before, and the same was true for Cairo and for, you know, he was everywhere. Turkey was everywhere. That's why it created these impression as if Turkey was a serious regional power. And also in Syria, Turkey looked like, you know, one of the most important actors. We will remember Erdogan, I think in 2012, that soon they'll be doing the namaz in, you know, will be doing prayers in Damascus and so on. So, but you know, Turkey's foreign policy has collapsed on so many fronts that now it's all about damage limitation. So what we see is that Turkey's foreign policy has become much more low profile, that it has gone back to the US positions in all major issues, also in Syria, I think. So this attempt of creating an autonomous foreign policy based on values and the idea of regional leadership has collapsed in many ways, and that's why now I think Turkey has been completely reined in terms of its Syria policy with the United States.
Well, I'm sure there are many other questions. I have many other questions, but we have to leave it at that. And there's food outside, so we can continue talking over a bit of food. Thank you so much, and thank you, our dear guests.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.